Marcus Kane had once been the most feared right hand of an empire that ruled the shadows of the city. But years ago, he vanished to live like an ordinary man after the death of his wife. No one remembered his real face anymore. Then came one night when he walked into a nightclub searching for his assistant Emma, and he froze at the sight of her forced to dance with Capo Dominic Russo, a man who had once betrayed the very organization that made him. Laughter rang across the room like a blade. Marcus clenched his fist until his knuckles turned white. He stepped forward, and with a single sentence, the entire nightclub fell silent. "This ends now." Marcus Kane was 40 years old, and anyone who met him would have called him an unremarkable man. He owned a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, a place with a rusted sign and an old radio that never stopped playing country music. He spoke little, worked with his hands, and never raised his voice, not even when customers argued over prices. People in the neighborhood loved him the way they loved a quiet fixture of their lives. Someone dependable, someone who never asked for more than what was fair. Years earlier, he had raised a son alone after tragedy took his wife. And now that his son had grown and moved away to build his own life, Marcus lived by himself, in a modest house, with a garden he barely tended. He liked the silence. He liked being forgotten. Emma Whitfield was 29, sharp-eyed, and precise in everything she did. She worked as the personal assistant to Vincent Romano, the chairman of Romano Holdings, a company that on paper dealt in real estate and private investment. She managed his calendar, his crises, and his temper with the same calm efficiency, never flinching even when the demands grew unreasonable. Colleagues respected her because she never panicked, and rivals underestimated her for the same reason. She drove an aging sedan that broke down more often than it should have. And that was how she first came to Marcus Kane's garage on a rainy afternoon 2 years before this story truly begins. At first, their conversations were short, limited to engine trouble and invoice totals. But something about Marcus's quiet steadiness drew her back even when her car needed no repairs at all. She would bring him coffee in the mornings before work, and he would fix small things on her car without charging her. A loose mirror, a squeaking belt, nothing that mattered except the excuse it gave them to talk. Neither of them spoke of what was growing between them, though anyone watching could have seen it in the way Marcus's expression softened whenever she walked through the door. To Emma, he was a rare kind of calm in a world that constantly demanded more from her. To Marcus, she was the first person in years who made him forget the silence he had built around himself. For a long while, their story felt like nothing more than a gentle romance waiting patiently to bloom. Two ordinary people circling each other with quiet affection neither dared to name. Neighbors joked that Marcus smiled more since Emma started visiting. Emma's co-workers noticed she left the office earlier on the days she planned to stop by his shop. It was the kind of tenderness that asked for nothing and expected nothing, built slowly across small gestures rather than grand declarations, and for a while, that was enough for both of them. Nothing about their lives suggested there was a darker world waiting just beneath the surface. Patient and hungry, ready to pull them both back into it. Marcus kept a photograph of his late wife tucked inside a drawer in the garage office. A small kindness he allowed himself on quiet afternoons when the shop was empty, and the past felt safe enough to visit. He never spoke of her to customers, never explained the faint sadness that sometimes crossed his face without warning. And Emma, sensing there was pain she had not yet earned the right to ask about, never pushed him to explain it. Instead, she simply stayed present, bringing coffee on cold mornings, lingering an extra few minutes after her car needed nothing more, letting her presence speak where words might have felt intrusive. Marcus noticed the patience in that restraint more than he ever told her, and it became, without either of them naming it, the quiet foundation of something neither was ready to call love just yet. There was an ordinary Tuesday, unremarkable in every way, except that it planted a seed neither of them forgot. When Emma's car broke down 2 streets from the garage during a sudden downpour, Marcus walked out in the rain without an umbrella to tow it back himself, refusing her apologies, insisting it was no trouble at all, even as water soaked through his jacket. Afterward, dripping and laughing despite themselves, they sat together in the small waiting room drinking bad coffee from a machine that rarely worked properly. And for the first time, the conversation drifted somewhere personal, somewhere neither business nor small talk could reach. Emma mentioned, almost in passing, that she sometimes felt like her job asked more of her than any person should reasonably give. Marcus listened without offering advice, only presence, and something about that silence told her he understood exhaustion in a way most people never could. But quiet lives rarely stay quiet forever. And the first cracks began to show in ways too small for anyone but Marcus to notice. Emma started staying at the office long after the building emptied, her lights the last ones burning on the 14th floor. She began taking phone calls outside, pacing the sidewalk with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her voice dropping to a whisper whenever anyone walked too close. The easy warmth in her eyes gave way to something tighter, something exhausted, as though she were carrying a weight she refused to set down. Marcus noticed the shift, the way a man who once read danger for a living always would, in the tension of her shoulders and the way her gaze flicked toward the door of any room she entered. He asked her once, gently, if something was wrong, and she smiled the practiced smile of someone trained to reassure others, even while drowning herself. She told him it was only work. That Chairman Romano had grown demanding lately, that a merger was consuming every hour of her day. Marcus wanted to believe her, and for a while he did, because believing her was easier than acknowledging the instincts stirring awake inside him, instincts he had buried for 15 years. He told himself that everyone had hard weeks. He told himself the world he once knew was gone and could never reach into this quiet corner of his life again. He was wrong, and some part of him already knew it. One evening, closing the garage later than usual, Marcus saw Emma step out of a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing but streetlight. She glanced around before crossing quickly toward the building, her posture stiff, her eyes down. Marcus's hand froze on the roll-up door as he watched a man step out from the passenger side to speak with the driver, a tall figure in an expensive coat, who moved with the unmistakable confidence of someone used to being obeyed. The man's face was turned away, but something about his stance made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck rise. A recognition his mind refused to name just yet. Days later, Marcus finally saw the man's face clearly, and the sight of it nearly stopped his heart. It was Dominic Russo. Older now, harder around the eyes, but unmistakably the same man Marcus remembered from another lifetime. Dominic had once been a low-ranking soldier in the Romano organization, ambitious and calculating even then, always watching, always waiting for an opening. Marcus remembered warning the old boss about him more than once, remembered the young man's eyes following every conversation, as though calculating its price. Now Dominic wore the title of Capo, one of the most powerful men beneath Vincent Romano himself. And Emma was climbing into his car like it was routine. Marcus told himself there had to be an explanation, that perhaps this was simply business, some legitimate arrangement tied to Romano Holdings that had nothing to do with the world he had left behind. But the tightness in his chest refused to loosen, and old instincts, the ones that had once kept him alive through wars fought in silence, began to stir. He started watching more carefully, noting the timing of Emma's disappearances, the bruises of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Whatever she was tangled in, it was far heavier than office politics. And Marcus knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the past he had buried was somehow reaching for the present he had built. 15 years earlier, Marcus Kane had not been a mechanic at all, but the underboss of the Romano family, the second most powerful man in an organization that stretched its influence through half the state. He had been the man Vincent Romano trusted above all others, the one who settled disputes before they became wars, the one whose word alone could end a conflict that might otherwise have taken years to resolve. Men feared him not because he was cruel, but because he was exact, because he never made a threat he did not intend to keep, and because his calm was more terrifying than any display of rage. He had built his reputation on discipline, not violence, though he had never shied from violence when discipline failed. His wife, Sarah, had been the only person who ever saw past the reputation to the man underneath, the only one who made him believe he could someday leave that world behind and become something gentler. They had a son together, and for a brief handful of years, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where his hands built things instead of ending them. But the world he served did not release men easily, and one night, a rival family's retaliation meant for Marcus instead took Sarah from him. A mistake that cost her everything and left him hollowed out, in a way violence never had. Vincent Romano, who had loved Sarah like a daughter, did something almost unheard of in their world. He let Marcus walk away. The night Sarah died remained, even 15 years later, the single memory Marcus refused to revisit in detail, though its shape colored everything about the man he had chosen to become afterward. He remembered carrying his infant son through a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fear, remembered the silence of Vincent standing beside him at the funeral, offering no words because no words could have possibly been enough. Marcus made a decision that surprised even those who thought they understood him best. He did not seek vengeance against the men responsible, though vengeance had once been the answer to every wrong in his world. Instead, he asked only for release, understanding at last that continuing down that path would eventually cost him his son as well. And that was a price he refused to pay twice. Marcus disappeared completely after that, erasing every trace of the man he had been, changing his name only slightly, moving to a quiet town where nobody asked questions about scars they could not see. He raised his son alone, taught him nothing of the life he had left, and built a small, honest business with his own 2 hands, believing that distance and time would be enough to keep the past buried. Only Vincent Romano knew where he had gone, and even Vincent respected the silence Marcus had asked for, sending no word, making no demands, honoring the debt he felt he owed a man who had given the organization 15 years of loyalty. As far as the world of the Romano family was concerned, the legendary underboss Kane was dead, or as good as dead, a ghost story older Capos told to newer recruits. In the years since Marcus vanished, Dominic Russo had risen quickly through the ranks, filling the vacuum his departure left behind with a hunger that bordered on desperation. He was skilled, patient, and utterly without the restraint that had once made Marcus so effective, willing to make promises he never intended to keep if it meant climbing another rung of power. Marcus had warned Vincent about him once, years before Sarah's death, sensing something calculating beneath Dominic's eager loyalty. But Vincent had dismissed the concern as the caution of a man who trusted no one completely. Now, watching from a distance he thought would always separate him from that world, Marcus understood with sickening clarity what kind of man now held Emma's fate in his hands, and what kind of danger that meant for her. The night everything came apart began with an invitation Emma could not refuse, delivered not as a request but as an order dressed in politeness. Dominic informed her that certain investors, men whose business Romano Holdings depended on maintaining, expected to be entertained at an exclusive nightclub downtown, and that her presence there was, in his words, essential to keeping the deal alive. Emma understood immediately what was being asked of her, understood it in the particular way women who navigate rooms of powerful men always understand such requests, and she refused as firmly as she dared. Dominic's smile never wavered, but his voice dropped into something colder, something that made the threat beneath his words unmistakable, even without him raising his voice. He reminded her, calmly, that Chairman Romano's legitimate business ventures rested on foundations far more fragile than she realized, foundations that certain parties could collapse with a single phone call if they were displeased. He told her that her loyalty to Vincent, whatever its source, would mean nothing if the man lost everything he had built, and that refusing tonight's simple request could set exactly that collapse into motion. Emma felt the walls close in around her, understood that this was no longer about one evening of discomfort, but about protecting a man who had trusted her. And after a long, breathless silence, she agreed to go. She told herself it would be one night, one performance, and then she would find a way out of whatever web Dominic had spun around her. Emma dressed for the evening the way a soldier might dress for a battle she had no choice but to fight, choosing her clothing carefully, rehearsing her expressions in the mirror until fear no longer showed on her face. She thought briefly of calling Marcus, of telling him the truth she had kept from him for 2 long years, but she stopped herself each time, unwilling to drag him into danger that belonged to a life he had worked so hard to leave behind. She told herself she was protecting him by staying silent, though some quieter part of her wondered if she was only protecting herself from watching him worry. By the time the car arrived to collect her, she had folded every trace of fear deep beneath a composed, professional mask that had served her well through 2 years of impossible pressure. Inside the nightclub, the air was thick with bass, and the artificial shimmer of colored lights sweeping across a crowd too drunk on power and liquor to notice the fear behind Emma's practiced smile. Dominic kept her close all evening, introducing her to men whose names she memorized out of habit, but whose intentions she understood too well, and every hour that passed felt like a small piece of herself being spent against her will. When the music shifted into something heavier, Dominic took her hand and pulled her onto the dance floor in front of everyone, his grip firm enough to make refusal impossible, without a scene neither of them could afford. The crowd around them cheered, oblivious or indifferent to the tension radiating from the woman forced to move in step with a man she despised. Marcus arrived at the club that night for a reason far simpler than fate, though it would feel like fate to everyone who later heard the story. Emma had missed their planned coffee that morning without explanation, had not answered his calls through the afternoon, and by evening his unease had hardened into something he could no longer ignore. He tracked down the address through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned, almost in passing, that Emma sometimes attended events at this particular club with people from her office. He told himself he was only checking on a friend, only making sure she was safe. But some older part of him, some instinct that had never truly slept, already sensed he was walking back into the world he had spent 15 years running from. He pushed through the crowd near the entrance, scanning faces with the practiced efficiency of a man who had once read rooms for a living. And then he saw her. Emma stood in the center of the dance floor, her face carefully composed into something that might have fooled a stranger but could never fool him, her eyes carrying a desperation she was fighting hard to hide. Beside her, one hand resting possessively at her waist, stood Dominic Russo, laughing at something one of his men had said, utterly certain of his own dominion over the room and everyone in it. The sight hit Marcus like a physical blow. 15 years of careful distance collapsing in an instant, replaced by a fury so old and so familiar, it frightened him with how easily it returned. For a long moment, Marcus stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, the noise of the club fading into a dull roar beneath the pounding of his own pulse. He watched Emma's eyes catch his across the room, watched the flicker of confusion, and then desperate relief pass across her face before she quickly looked away, afraid of what recognition might cost her. Something inside Marcus, something he had buried beside his wife 15 years earlier, rose up with terrible clarity, and every careful habit of restraint he had built around himself began to crack. He was no longer thinking of himself as a mechanic who wanted to be left alone. He was remembering exactly who he used to be, and exactly what he was capable of when someone he loved was threatened. Marcus moved through the crowd with a stillness that felt wrong in a room built for chaos, people stepping aside without quite understanding why they felt compelled to. Dominic's men noticed him first, two broad-shouldered figures who peeled away from the bar to intercept him, their posture shifting into the practiced readiness of men accustomed to trouble. Marcus did not slow his pace, did not raise his voice, did not so much as glance at the men closing in on either side of him. His eyes stayed fixed on Dominic, and on the woman still trapped in his grip. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the music without needing to shout at all. "This ends now." The words meant nothing to most of the people in that club, 3 simple syllables lost easily beneath the bass. But Dominic's men laughed at the audacity of a stranger issuing commands in a room he did not control. One of them, a thick-necked man with a scar through his eyebrow, grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and shoved him backward, expecting the crowd to swallow him whole the way it swallowed every other drunk fool who wandered too close to Dominic's circle. Instead, Marcus turned the shove into motion, and within seconds the man found himself on the floor, disarmed of both his balance and his confidence before he understood what had happened. A second man lunged forward and met the same fate almost as quickly, the fight lasting only a handful of seconds before the surrounding crowd realized something was deeply wrong. The music kept playing, but the dance floor around Marcus had gone still, a widening circle of silence spreading outward as more people noticed the 2 men groaning on the ground. Dominic's easy laughter died in his throat as he finally turned to face the stranger who had just dismantled his security with an efficiency that felt disturbingly familiar. He studied Marcus's face, for the first time, really studied it. And something in his expression flickered, a half-formed recognition he could not yet place. Buried beneath years of assuming the man he remembered was long gone or long dead, Marcus held his gaze without blinking, without softening, the calm of his expression far more unsettling than any display of rage could have been. "I gave you a chance to change," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like something sharpened over many years of silence. Dominic's confidence wavered for the first time all evening. his mind scrambling to place the voice against a memory he had buried deep. A memory from before his rise to power, from a time when he had been nothing more than a nervous soldier hoping to be noticed. The certainty in Marcus's tone did not belong to a stranger, and Dominic felt an old, familiar dread settle into his stomach, even before his mind fully caught up to what his instincts already understood. Emma, still standing frozen beside him, watched the color drain from Dominic's face and wondered, for the first time, exactly who the quiet mechanic she had fallen for truly was. Marcus said the name slowly, deliberately, letting each syllable land, with the full weight of everything it represented. He did not shout it, did not need to, because a name spoken with that much certainty required no volume to command a room. Dominic staggered backward as though struck, his hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the bar to steady himself. His face draining of every trace of color it had held moments before. Around them, the older men in the room, the ones who had been in the organization long enough to remember, began rising slowly from their seats, disbelief and something close to reverence spreading across their weathered faces in equal measure. An elderly capo near the back of the room, a man named Salvatore who had served the Romano family for over 3 decades, rose to his feet with trembling hands and stared at Marcus, as though looking at a ghost given flesh. "Impossible," he whispered, the word carrying further than he intended, in the sudden hush that had swallowed the club whole. "Underboss Kane," he said again, louder this time, disbelief cracking into something closer to awe, as the name spread outward through the crowd like fire catching dry grass. Within moments, every person in that room who understood what the name meant had gone utterly still, staring at the man they had believed dead or vanished for 15 long years. Whispers rippled through the club faster than anyone could contain them, the name passing from mouth to mouth until even those who had no idea who Marcus Kane truly was could sense the seismic shift happening around them. Emma stood frozen in the center of it all, watching grown men who had terrified her for weeks suddenly shrink back in something resembling fear, all directed at the quiet gentleman who fixed her car and never raised his voice. She searched Marcus's face for some sign of the stranger everyone else seemed to see, some hint of the legend whispered in reverent, frightened tones, but all she found was the same steady calm she had always known, now carrying a weight she had never suspected. The revelation left her breathless, not with fear of him, but with the staggering realization of everything he must have carried silently every single day they had known each other. Dominic recovered his composure faster than the others, though his voice betrayed the tremor he could not fully suppress. He refused to accept defeat so easily, after building his entire empire on the assumption that the old underboss would never return. And pride, more than wisdom, pushed him toward a decision that would cost him everything. He barked an order to the remaining men stationed around the club, and within seconds, weapons appeared beneath jackets and behind the bar, the atmosphere shifting from shock into something far more dangerous. Marcus did not flinch. He had expected exactly this reaction, and he had not walked into that club without preparing for the possibility that Dominic would choose violence over surrender. What Dominic did not know, what he could not have anticipated, was that Marcus had spent the walk from the entrance to the dance floor doing far more than confronting a man who threatened Emma. He had sent a single message before stepping through those doors, a message to people he had not spoken to in 15 years, but who had never truly stopped watching over the family's interests from a distance. As Dominic's men raised their weapons, the doors of the club burst open, and a wave of unfamiliar faces flooded in. Men who moved with the same disciplined precision Marcus himself once commanded. Men whose loyalty had never belonged to Dominic Russo at all. Dominic watched in growing horror as more than half of his own men lowered their weapons the moment they recognized the new arrivals, some even stepping forward to stand beside them instead of beside him. These were soldiers who remembered the old underboss, who had served under him before his disappearance, and whose loyalty, it became devastatingly clear, had never truly transferred to the man who replaced him. Dominic realized, with dawning terror, that his authority had been built on assumption rather than genuine allegiance, propped up only by the belief that Marcus Kane would never return to claim what remained his. That illusion shattered completely the moment reinforcements filled the club, leaving Dominic standing nearly alone in a room that had, in the span of minutes, turned entirely against him. Among the men who crossed the floor to stand with Marcus was Salvatore's own nephew, a younger soldier who had grown up hearing stories about the legendary underboss from his uncle's dinner table, never once expecting to witness the man in person. He approached Marcus slowly, almost reverently, and lowered his weapon to the floor before stepping back into formation, a gesture that rippled through the remaining crowd like a signal. One by one, other soldiers, who had quietly resented Dominic's cruelty for years, who had followed him only out of fear rather than respect, found the courage to do the same. Within minutes, the balance of power in that room had shifted so completely that Dominic's earlier confidence seemed almost laughable in hindsight, a house of cards that had needed only a single gust of truth to collapse entirely. Then the crowd near the entrance parted once more, and Vincent Romano himself walked through, older now, his hair fully silver, but his presence commanding the same absolute authority it always had. The room fell into an even deeper silence, every remaining loyalist and bystander understanding instinctively that whatever happened next would be decided by the man who had built this world from nothing decades earlier. Vincent's eyes found Marcus first, and something passed between the two men, a recognition heavier than words. 15 years of separation, collapsing in a single shared glance. Then his gaze shifted to Dominic, and the warmth Vincent had shown Marcus disappeared entirely, replaced by a coldness that made even hardened men in the room take an involuntary step backward. Vincent revealed, in a voice that carried effortlessly across the silent club, that Emma had never truly been Dominic's ally at all, despite whatever impression Dominic had spent months carefully constructing. She had come to him privately nearly 2 years earlier, terrified but resolute, bringing evidence that something was deeply wrong within the organization's newer dealings. Since then, she had worked quietly and dangerously close to Dominic, gathering proof of exactly what he had been doing behind Vincent's back, risking her safety every single day she remained inside his circle of trust. Marcus listened, and something in his chest tightened painfully as he understood, finally, the true weight Emma had been carrying alone for months, the fear he had sensed but never fully grasped. Vincent detailed, with the precision of a man who had reviewed every document himself, exactly how far Dominic's betrayal had reached. Dominic had been laundering money through shell operations tied loosely to Romano Holdings, exposing Vincent's legitimate businesses to risks he never sanctioned and never knew existed. He had made secret arrangements with rival organizations, trading information and favors that directly endangered the family's interests, all while presenting himself publicly as Vincent's most loyal capo. Emma had documented every transaction, every meeting, every whispered arrangement, compiling a case so thorough that even Dominic's most devoted allies would struggle to defend him once the evidence became known. Marcus turned to look at Emma then, seeing her fully for perhaps the first time, understanding that the woman he had fallen for was not merely brave by accident but courageous by deliberate, terrifying choice. She had spent 2 years walking a tightrope over an abyss most people could not have survived crossing once, protecting a man who had once loved her like family, carrying secrets that could have gotten her killed at any moment. Marcus felt something close to shame settle over him, not for who he had once been, but for how long it had taken him to notice how much danger she had quietly absorbed to keep others safe. He crossed the small distance between them and spoke softly. His voice meant only for her, despite the silent room around them, offering an apology for arriving so late to protect what mattered most. Emma shook her head gently, tears finally breaking free after weeks of forced composure, and told him that his arrival, however late it felt to him, had come at exactly the moment she needed someone most. She confessed how many nights she had wondered whether she would survive long enough to see the evidence matter, how many times she had nearly given up under the weight of Dominic's threats. Marcus reached out and took her hand, an act so simple it seemed impossible that it carried the full history of everything unspoken between them for 2 years. In that single gesture, surrounded by the wreckage of a world neither of them had chosen, something unspoken finally became real. Dominic, watching his empire dissolve in real time, made one final desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his authority. Appealing directly to the older capos scattered around the room, he reminded them of favors he had done, of years of service, of loyalty he claimed, had never wavered despite what Vincent's evidence suggested. But the room had already made its judgment, the weight of Marcus's return combined with Vincent's damning revelations, leaving no room for sympathy toward a man who had betrayed the very family that raised him. Salvatore, the elderly capo who had first recognized Marcus, stepped forward and spoke for the gathered men, declaring that Dominic's fate belonged now to the council, not to whatever mercy he hoped to beg from the crowd. The formal gathering of the council took place 3 days later, in a room far quieter than the nightclub had been, wood-paneled walls holding decades of history within their grain. Every senior capo who remained loyal to the Romano family sat in judgment, Vincent presiding at the head of the table with Marcus seated at his right hand, a position he had not occupied in 15 years but slipped back into with unsettling ease. Dominic stood before them, stripped of the confidence that had defined him for years, forced now to answer for evidence too thorough to dispute or deny. Emma's documentation, meticulous and damning, left no room for the kind of ambiguity that might once have saved a man in his position. When the council turned to Marcus and asked what fate Dominic deserved, the room fell into an anticipatory silence, most expecting the legendary underboss to demand the harshest possible punishment for a man who had endangered someone he loved. Instead, Marcus spoke with the same measured calm that had defined him even in his most dangerous years, reminding the gathered men of principles that had built their organization long before ambition and greed corrupted it. The family exists because of order, he told them, not because of any single man's ego or hunger for power. Punishment delivered in anger accomplishes nothing lasting, he continued. But justice delivered with discipline restores exactly what men like Dominic had tried to destroy. Marcus proposed that Dominic be stripped entirely of his title and, standing within the organization, his name erased from every record of authority the family maintained. More than that, he insisted that the evidence Emma had gathered be handed, carefully and anonymously, to the appropriate authorities investigating financial crimes unrelated to violence, ensuring Dominic faced consequences within the legal system rather than becoming a martyr within their own. Several capos exchanged surprised glances at the suggestion, unaccustomed to such restraint from a man whose reputation had been built on decisive, immediate action. But Vincent nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Marcus intended, recognizing an opportunity not just to punish one man, but to begin reshaping an organization that had drifted too far from the principles it once claimed to honor. The council voted unanimously to accept Marcus's proposal, and within weeks, Dominic Russo's name became synonymous with disgrace throughout every circle he had once commanded. Federal investigators, acting on evidence delivered through channels too clean to trace back to its true source, began building a case against him that would eventually see him removed entirely from the world he had spent his life trying to conquer. The Romano family, meanwhile, began a quiet but deliberate transformation, purging the corruption that had grown unchecked during the years Marcus had been absent. Capos, who had enabled Dominic's schemes for personal gain, found themselves gradually replaced by men and women who remembered, or had been taught, what loyalty and discipline were meant to look like. Salvatore, watching the transformation unfold from his seat on the council, remarked to Vincent one evening that the family finally resembled the organization he had sworn loyalty to as a young man, decades before ambition and greed had quietly eroded its foundations. Vincent agreed, though he was careful to credit the change not to any single man's return, but to the courage of a woman who had risked everything to expose what others had been too afraid or too complicit to confront. Marcus, for his part, refused every offer to reclaim his old title, insisting instead that his role going forward would be advisory at best, a quiet presence rather than a commanding one. He had learned, in the years of his absence, that true strength sometimes meant stepping back rather than stepping forward, and he intended to honor that lesson for whatever years remained ahead of him. Emma found herself, almost overnight, transformed from a frightened assistant into someone spoken of with genuine respect throughout the organization's legitimate business circles. Her courage in gathering evidence under such dangerous circumstances became something close to legend among those who understood the risks she had taken, and Vincent made certain she was rewarded appropriately for everything she had sacrificed. But more than any reward or recognition, what Emma valued most was the simple fact that the constant fear that had defined her days for 2 years finally, completely, lifted from her shoulders. She could breathe again without calculating danger in every conversation, without wondering if today would be the day her cover finally collapsed. Months passed, and the frantic urgency of that single explosive night gradually settled into something calmer, something closer to the ordinary rhythm of life that both Marcus and Emma had craved all along. Marcus expanded his small auto shop, hiring 2 additional mechanics to keep pace with growing business, though he still insisted on personally handling any car that came from someone he considered a friend. He remained, in most ways that mattered, exactly the man he had been before that night: quiet, steady, generous with his time and skill, though something in his posture now carried a settled peace that had been missing before Emma re-entered his life fully. Emma made the decision, not long after the dust settled, to leave her position as Vincent's assistant, choosing instead to direct a charitable foundation Vincent established using funds recovered from Dominic's illegal operations. The work suited her perfectly, channeling her sharp mind and steady composure toward rebuilding communities rather than navigating the constant tension of corporate crisis management. Vincent, grateful beyond measure for everything she had sacrificed on his behalf, gave her complete authority over the foundation's direction, trusting her judgment as thoroughly as he had once trusted Marcus's. Marcus, for his part, began quietly assisting Vincent in untangling the legitimate business ventures from whatever remained of the family's less savory history, using his old knowledge to help build something cleaner in its place. On the evening the foundation officially opened its doors, a modest gathering filled a renovated community center that had once been slated for demolition before Vincent's funding intervened. String lights hung across the ceiling, casting warm gold light over tables of simple food and the quiet murmur of genuine conversation. Nothing like the chaos and danger of the nightclub, where their story had nearly ended months before. Emma stood near the entrance, greeting guests, her exhaustion long replaced by something brighter, something that looked, to anyone watching closely, remarkably like hope. Marcus arrived later than most, dressed simply as always, carrying none of the weight that had once defined every room he entered. Emma found him near the edge of the gathering, watching the crowd with the same quiet contentment he brought to everything now, and she asked him, half teasing and half serious, whether he intended to disappear again someday the way he once had. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that Emma deserved more than a casual reassurance after everything they had survived together. He told her, simply, that he had spent 15 years running from a past he could not change, building silence around himself because he believed it was the only way to protect what little peace he had left. But standing there beside her, watching a room full of people who trusted him without fear, he finally understood that peace was not something built through vanishing. No, he told her, his voice steady and certain in a way that left no room for doubt. This time, he wanted to live toward something, not away from it. He wanted a future built openly, without secrets buried beneath careful silence, without a past he had to keep hidden from the people he loved most. Emma's eyes softened at his words, and without either of them needing to say anything more, she reached for his hand the way she had that night in the nightclub, except this time there was no danger pressing in around them, only the quiet promise of everything still to come. They walked out together into the cool evening air, leaving behind the warmth and noise of the celebration, moving at the unhurried pace of 2 people who finally had all the time in the world. Behind them, the organization that had once defined so much of Marcus's life continued its slow transformation into something steadier, something worthy of the principles he had always believed it should embody. Dominic Russo faced the consequences of his choices far from the world he once ruled, a cautionary tale whispered among newer capos, who would never fully understand the man who brought him down. The Mafia's shadow, once so heavy over Marcus's every waking moment, had finally receded into something manageable, something that no longer controlled the shape of his days. There were no more secrets waiting to surface, no more phone calls that arrived at midnight demanding silence, no more danger lurking just beyond the edges of an ordinary life. What remained, for Marcus and Emma both, was something far simpler and far more valuable than the power either of their worlds had once offered. A small house with a garden, Marcus finally found time to tend properly, a foundation that gave Emma purpose without fear attached to it. 2 people who had found each other first through quiet, ordinary kindness, and who had proven, when it mattered most, that they were willing to fight for exactly that kind of life. Peace, they both discovered, was not the absence of a story, but the reward for surviving one worth telling. In the years that followed, the garage on the edge of town became something of a quiet legend in its own right. though none of the customers who brought their cars there ever learned why the owner sometimes received visits from men in expensive suits who called him nothing but a name of deep respect. Vincent Romano stopped by occasionally, no longer as a boss seeking counsel from his underboss, but simply as an old friend sharing coffee on a slow afternoon, watching the family's legitimate ventures grow steadier under guidance neither of them had expected to give again. Emma's foundation expanded twice within its first 2 years, funding scholarships and rebuilding neighborhoods that had been neglected for decades, her name becoming known for entirely different reasons than the fear that once defined her nights. And Marcus, watching her thrive from across whatever room they happened to share, understood at last that the life he had once mourned as lost forever had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right person to help him find his way back to it.